Hey folks, Dr. Mike here for Renaissance Periodization. Today's topic is to ask the question, should you train strongman events to build muscle and burn fat? Notice I didn't say get better for strongmen, but a lot of folks have this question of, hey, what do you think of farmer's carries for building traps? What do you think of stone loading to build the back? What do you think of strongman events to do cardio and burn fat? Great questions. Let's answer them here today in that context. So, strongman events for muscle growth. We got three concepts here that we got to talk about. Number one, honest truth. The strongman events are awful for stimulus to fatigue ratios for muscle growth building. Okay. Yes, the farmer's walk will grow your traps a ton, but at a huge fatigue cost to your whole body. Just ask any strongman. If you do farmer's walk heavy enough, it breaks you down head to toe. It's a crazy high rating of perceived exertion. It beats up your whole body. It's a ton of fatigue for a very good stimulus. How do you get the same stimulus or better with less fatigue? First, stop walking, okay? In a farmer's carry, the walking is pointless for your traps. It has nothing to do with them. You get just as much trap stimulus standing. Okay, so now you're standing. But it's an isometric contraction at the very lengthened point. Good, but we can do better. What about a concentric movement? And an eccentric movement, and an isometric. What are we doing now? Those are just shrugs. Shrugs standing in place are more hypertrophic than farmer's carries, and at the same time less fatiguing because you're not moving around, and you're using a little bit less weight, but getting range of motion with it. You don't say that you're going to get the biggest quads ever, hopefully, by doing yoke walks. So why would you get the biggest traps ever by doing farmer's carries? It doesn't make a whole lot of sense when you examine what the ingredients are for generating the most hypertrophy and the least fatigue, the least irrelevant movement possible, and using a load that you can control for the concentric, isometric hold at the bottom and the top, and an eccentric controlled contraction. You get all of those just doing shrugs properly. Yes, farmer's walk does grow your traps, but the fatigue cost is way too high for the pretty decent stimulus you get. But you can get a great stimulus, much lower fatigue if you do shrugs. I know it's not as sexy. I know it's not as fun, but that is the truth of the matter. To that end, strongmen know this almost universally, especially high-level experienced ones. They use powerlifting and bodybuilding movements to put on size. They don't use the events to put on size. They get their huge backs with bent rows and machine rows and deadlifts, and then they take those backs to the stones to practice stone loading. Some excess hypertrophy occurs, definitely from the stones. It's always helpful, but if they really wanted more hypertrophy and less fatigue, they would never do stone loading. It's a technical event to get good at stones, right? Big Z himself, maybe the strongest human that's ever lived, definitely competitively, as far as history, the greatest strongman of all time, does incline Smith machine barbell presses to get his pressing hypertrophy going. And then he's pressed overhead in strongman competition more than anyone ever in the entire world. Still to this day owns the log press world record. Hilarious YouTube video of Big Z doing incline presses, and there's an awesome incel comment on the YouTube video, which got like 500 responses, not very good ones. I'll tell you what he said, and you'll be sympathetic. It's some kid who's like, hey man, you might not want to use the incline Smith machine for this. You're better off growing your shoulders with standing overhead barbell presses. Like, you dumb motherfucker. You're talking to someone whose shoulders are bigger than your glutes and who invented the overhead. This is the greatest overhead lifter of all time. Thanks for your insight. And here's the thing, that kid could have been right, but he wasn't right, because if Big Z tried to grow his shoulders and his triceps and his upper pecs with standing presses or strongman log lifts, the fatigue would have been so high for the limited stimulus, it wouldn't have been worth it. So when he needs to grow muscle, he sits into a Smith machine and pumps out the reps. When he needs to get stronger, he does strict presses and incline presses with a barbell. And when he needs to get that strength tailored to strongman, then he practices the events. But if you're just focused on your physique, there's no reason for you to do the strongman events, because they're not the best use of time for building muscle itself. Joey Satmary, Sat Strength on YouTube, give him a follow. He's one of our training partners, and Charlie and I will train with him. We do very similar training with him when he's in a hypertrophy phase. He trains a lot like a bodybuilder. The difference is Charlie and I, his training partners, never do stone loading or yokes or anything like that, and he does for the technical practice. He's under no illusion that stones are going to get him jacked. Bent rows and pull-ups and pull-downs are, and the stones get him a little bit more jacked, but the main reason he does them is for that technical contribution. Lastly, we don't want to put a sort of dark cloud over strongman for hypertrophy. Strongman training is super fun. And if you can fit it into your maximum recoverable volume for hypertrophy, absolutely go to town and do it. Load some stones, carry the yoke, do some log presses. It'll help you get more jacked. Just make sure it fits in your MRV. And when you are pushing hypertrophy as a real number one priority towards the end of a fat loss phase and a really big important gain phase in a competitive season for bodybuilding, move away from the strongman movements, perhaps completely or mostly, and do more actual hypertrophy work. But during maintenance phases, active rest phases, just generally when you're having fun gaining muscle, you can pepper in some strongman movements. Just know the trade-offs and don't think, okay, I'm going to do yoke walks. That's going to grow my erectors more than anything else. It's very unlikely, but if you want to do them because they're fun and they help you grow, not optimally, look, it's not all about optimal, and strongman is not only just fun, but makes you real world strong in a way nothing else can, that's totally cool. Just know the trade-offs you're getting into, okay? You buy a station wagon because it can take your kids and groceries around. You don't buy it to be the fastest car ever. And if you're like, this station wagon's the fastest car ever, you're just making a really big mistake. Know what you're getting yourself into. And if you're cool with that, that's totally fine. Now, let's talk about strongman events for cardio. Here's the thing. Point number one, similar to point number one in strongman events for size. The events have awful stimulus to fatigue ratios for cardio. What the hell is a stimulus to fatigue ratio for cardio? What's the stimulus of cardio? The stimulus in cardio is calories burned per unit time. So you have that in the numerator, how many calories you burn per unit time, and you divide that by the amount of fatigue. The higher the fatigue and the lower the calories per unit time, the worse. What has the highest SFRs in cardio? Gee, it's really hard to beat incline walking or the elliptical or stationary ergometer rowing. It's very not fatiguing, and per hour, you burn a fuckload of calories. You incline walking for an hour, that's like 700 calories. And like someone's like, hey, are you really tired and beat up? You're like, not really. I just took like an hour-long walk. I just listened to a podcast the whole time. What about if you load stones, okay, for an hour? How many calories do you burn per hour stone loading? Actually, a lot, more than walking. Has anyone ever loaded stones continuously for an hour? The answer is no. And if you tried, you would die. So what would you do if you did cardio for stone loading? You would do stone loading for an hour, but you take so many breaks and so on and so forth, you might load like 30 or 40 total stones during that time. But that's pretty cool. How much calories are you burning then? Maybe 200 or 300, whereas if you just incline walk that entire time, you would burn like 400 or 500 or more or something, right? So you burn more calories incline walking because it's continuous than you do loading stones. And if you even did so much stone loading that you got the same calories burned, loading stones for an hour, even if there's plenty of breaks, even if you burn 700 calories, is going to be an unbelievable amount of fatigue. Your lower back is fucked. Everything's fucked. Your whole system, your biceps, your forearms, everything's gone. You can't just do that 4 or 5 times a week. You will break into pieces. Can you incline walk for an hour on a treadmill 4 or 5 times a week? Of course you can. Bodybuilders of the world overdo it all the time. So on stimulus to fatigue, strongman events for cardio are really just not a good idea. Other modalities are better. If you want to use your back, your biceps, and your rear delts for cardio and some of your hip muscles and so on and so forth, just get on the ergometer and do distance rowing. 1 hour of that will burn tons of calories, minimal amount of fatigue. If you do stones instead or something like that, it's just, sure, you can burn a lot of calories at an unbelievable fatigue expense. Absolutely not worth it in most cases. Now, for recreational fitness folks, strongman for cardio is totally fine because it's super fun. And a lot of times they need more real world strength and some muscle growth and some fat loss. And strongman events give them a really good mix of that, right? So it's totally fine to do for your regular clients that train with you 3 or 4 times a week, do some regular hypertrophy training, you do some strongman type stuff, and then in their own time, maybe they're elevating their physical activity, doing a bit of their own cardio and controlling their diet. That's totally cool. But if you're very serious about fat loss and muscle retention, right? You're, let's say, interested in competing in bodybuilding or something like that, some light strongman work can be okay, but be careful and know when more boring, high stimulus to fatigue ratio cardio is better. I myself, a very analogous example of this, I do Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I compete in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. It's super fun. It burns a shitload of calories. What is the fatigue cost? Fucking kidding me? There's people trying to kill me. My bones are halfway broken every time I'm done jiu-jitsu. There's a sensation everyone knows when they get back from especially gi jiu-jitsu where the next day your fingers barely work. There's like this, like you have arthritis all over all of your hands. You're like, oh my God, what the hell happened to me? That's a whole body sensation from jiu-jitsu that happens all the time. So is jiu-jitsu good for cardio? If you're only looking at the side of the equation that says how many calories you burn, 100%. What about fatigue? Terrible. So when I'm getting really serious about hypertrophy training towards the end of a fat loss diet, I'll do less jujitsu because I know it's not a good idea. That means I do less jujitsu, which is super fun for me, and I do more like incline treadmill cardio, which sucks. Do I like it? No, but that's the reality of what I have to do. So just know what trade-offs you're getting yourself into. If you want to do strongman, it's totally cool. Just understand it's not the best way to grow muscle. It's not the best way to lose fat. But there are some contexts, if you're willing to make the trade-offs, in which it's totally fine. And honestly, it's one of the sports for me. I have very few sports which I watch as a fan. Okay, I don't know any football team names, a basketball, I don't know, is that a sport with a tennis racket? Who knows? I'm a huge fan of strongman. I've watched like every single World's Strongest Man, all the heats. I love strongman. It's a beautiful, amazing sport, and you can do it. Just understand that strongmen themselves make tons of trade-offs and be willing to do the same.